I want you to imagine sitting in church on a Sunday morning, holding your husband's hand, while the man standing at the altar, the bishop himself, looks directly into your eyes and lies to your face to protect the very man you married. That is not a sentence from a movie. That is the exact moment my entire life cracked open, and I did not even know it yet. I thought it was just another Sunday. I thought I was just another wife sitting in the third pew from the front, the same spot we sat in every single week for 11 years. But that Sunday, something in the bishop's voice shook, just slightly, just enough that if you were not paying attention, you would miss it completely. But I was paying attention, because 3 nights before that Sunday, I had found something in my husband's car that he never meant for me to find. And when I tried to ask the one man I trusted more than anyone, the one man who had baptized our children, who had counseled us through our worst arguments, who had sat across from me at our kitchen table more times than I can count, when I tried to ask him the truth, he looked at me, and he chose my husband over me. He chose a lie over me. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened, step by step, because by the end of this story, you are going to ask yourself the same question I have been asking myself for months. If the man of God already knew, why did he let me keep believing the lie? Stay with me, because this story is not just about a husband who betrayed his wife. It is about an entire system, an entire community, an entire church family who knew something was wrong long before I did and chose silence. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me up at 3 in the morning, is that I am still not completely sure I know the whole truth, not even now. Let me take you back to where this really started, because you need to understand who I was before all of this, so you can understand exactly how far I fell. My name does not matter for this story. What matters is that I was the kind of wife who believed her marriage was the safest place in the world. My husband, I will call him Daniel, was a deacon in our church. Not the bishop, not the pastor, but a respected man in our congregation. Someone people came to for advice. Someone who led Bible study on Wednesday nights. Someone who shook every single hand at the door after service with a smile that made people feel like they mattered. People loved Daniel. I loved Daniel. We had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, and on the outside, we were the family everyone pointed to when they wanted to describe what a strong Christian marriage looked like. Married 11 years. No major fights that anyone outside our home ever heard about. We tithed every month without missing once. We hosted the youth group at our house twice a year. I used to stand in our kitchen, looking out at our backyard while the teenagers from church played volleyball, and I used to think, this is it. This is the life I prayed for. But here is something I learned the hard way, and I want you to remember it as you listen to the rest of this story. The families that look the most perfect from the outside are sometimes hiding the deepest cracks, and the people closest to you, the ones who smile at you every single Sunday, might already know exactly what is hiding behind that perfect image, and they might have decided, long before you ever found out, that protecting the image mattered more than protecting you. It started with something so small that I almost did not think twice about it. Daniel began staying late at the church more often. At first it was once a week, then twice. Then it became almost every single day, sometimes coming home after 9 at night, saying he was helping the bishop with administrative work, financial counseling for couples in the congregation, things like that. I did not question it, because why would I? My husband worked for the church in a sense, volunteering so much of his time that it felt normal for him to be there constantly. The bishop himself used to call our house sometimes, in the evening, asking for Daniel, telling me how grateful he was to have a man like my husband helping carry the weight of the ministry. I remember feeling proud. I remember thinking, I am married to a good man, a man other men respect, a man even our bishop leans on. But then the small things started piling up. Daniel started keeping his phone face down on the table. He started taking calls outside, even in the middle of dinner. He started showering as soon as he got home from these late nights at church, which he had never done before in 11 years of marriage. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because if you have ever lived through betrayal, you know exactly what I am talking about. It is never one big red flag that breaks you. It is 50 small ones, stacked quietly on top of each other, until one day you look up and you realize you have been living inside a warning sign for months, and you convinced yourself it was nothing. I started noticing the way Daniel would get a text message and immediately put his phone in his pocket, instead of leaving it on the counter like he always had. I noticed he stopped letting me drive his car, saying the air conditioning was broken, and he did not want me dealing with it in the heat, even though it was October and barely warm. I noticed he started locking his phone with a passcode, something we had never done with each other in our entire marriage. Every excuse on its own sounded reasonable. Together, they painted a picture I refused to look directly at, and then came the night that changed everything. Daniel had gone to what he called an emergency elders meeting at the church, something about budget concerns for the upcoming building renovation. He left around 7 in the evening and told me he would probably be home late. Around 8:30, our son had a school project that needed a specific kind of poster board, the kind we did not have at home, and I remembered Daniel kept extra supplies like that in the trunk of his car from when he used to help run the children's ministry crafts table. So I went outside to check his trunk, thinking nothing of it, just a wife looking for poster board for her son's homework. What I found in that trunk was not poster board. I found a gift bag, the kind you would buy from a boutique, not a grocery store, tucked behind the spare tire, as if someone wanted it hidden, but did not have time to hide it well. Inside that bag was a necklace, still in its box, with a receipt dated 4 days earlier. The receipt had a name on it that I did not recognize as any family member, any niece, any goddaughter, anyone connected to our family at all. Next to the necklace was a folded piece of paper, a note, handwritten, that simply said, "I can't stop thinking about Sunday. Same time next week?" I stood there in our garage, holding that note under the single dim light bulb that Daniel always said he would replace and never did, and I felt my entire chest go cold. Not hot, cold, like ice water had been poured straight into my ribs. I want you to understand something about that moment, because people who have never been betrayed always imagine it as this dramatic, screaming, crying breakdown. It was not that. It was silence. A horrible, ringing silence where my brain refused to accept what my hands were holding. I did not confront him that night. I want to be honest with you about that because I think a lot of women listening to this have been in the exact same position, frozen, not because you are weak, but because some part of you is still desperately trying to find an explanation that does not destroy your entire life. I put the necklace back. I put the note back exactly where I found it. I went back inside, helped my son with his poster board using cardboard from a cereal box instead, put both my children to bed, and I lay awake until 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling, replaying every late night, every locked phone, every shower the second he got home. The next morning, I did something I am not proud of, but I think you will understand why I did it. I called the church office not to speak to Daniel, but to ask innocently whether Wednesday's elders meeting had been productive. Just casual small talk, the kind of thing a deacon's wife says all the time. The church secretary, a kind older woman named Carol, who had worked there for almost 20 years, paused for just a moment too long before answering. She said, "Oh, I believe so, hun, though I don't actually remember an elders meeting being on the calendar this week." Then she quickly added, "But you know how things get added last minute around here." That pause, that correction, that fast cover-up. It told me everything I needed to know before I even asked another question. There had been no elders meeting. My husband had lied to my face about where he was going. On the same night, I found a necklace meant for another woman in his trunk. I am going to pause the story right here for a second, because I want to ask you something. If you were me, in that moment, who would you have gone to? Your family? Your closest friend? A lawyer? I want you to really think about who you would trust with the most painful secret of your life. Because the person I chose to trust is the person who ended up breaking me even worse than my husband did, and his name was Bishop Whitfield. Bishop Whitfield had been the spiritual leader of our church for almost 15 years. He officiated our wedding. He baptized both of our children. He sat with me in the hospital waiting room when my daughter was born with complications, and held my hand while we prayed together at 4 in the morning. This was not some distant authority figure to me. This was a man I considered family, a man I trusted with my soul, let alone my marriage. So 3 days after I found that necklace, after watching Daniel continue to lie to my face about late nights and emergency meetings that Carol the secretary had already told me did not exist, I drove to the church on a Thursday afternoon, while Daniel was at his actual job, and I asked to speak with Bishop Whitfield privately. I remember sitting in his office, the same leather chair I had sat in during our premarital counseling 11 years earlier. The same wooden cross hanging behind his desk. The same smell of old books and coffee. I remember my hands shaking so badly that I had to hold them together in my lap just to keep them still. And I told him everything. The late nights, the locked phone, the showers, the necklace, the receipt, the note. I asked him directly because I was desperate, because I needed to know if this was a pattern he had seen before in Daniel, if there was anything at all, that he could tell me as our spiritual leader to help me understand what was happening to my marriage. And Bishop Whitfield's face did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. It did not show shock. It did not show surprise. For one single second before he composed himself, his expression showed something closer to exhaustion, like a man being asked a question he had been dreading for a very long time. Then he folded his hands on his desk, looked at me with what I can only describe as practiced compassion, and he said, "I think you might be misreading some very normal stress that comes with the demands of ministry work. Daniel has been under a lot of pressure helping me with the building fund. I would hate for you to destroy your marriage over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? He called a necklace, a receipt, and a love note a misunderstanding. I pushed back, gently at first, then more firmly, because something in his reaction did not sit right with me. I asked him directly, "Bishop, do you know something about this that I don't?" And he looked at me, and he lied. He looked me directly in the eyes and said the words, "I know nothing about any of this, and I think it would be wise for you to pray on it before you let suspicion destroy a good marriage." I left his office that day feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. Not because of what Daniel had done, because of what Bishop Whitfield had just done. He had taken my fear, my evidence, my pain, and he had folded it neatly back into my own hands and told me it was my fault for even questioning it. He had used the language of faith, the language I trusted my entire spiritual life to, as a weapon to protect my husband. For the next several weeks, I tried to convince myself the bishop was right. I prayed, I journaled, I told myself maybe I was projecting insecurities from my own childhood onto a marriage that was actually fine. This is something I need every single person listening to understand, because it is exactly how these situations survive as long as they do. The people around the betrayer, especially trusted authority figures, do not just stay silent. They actively talk you out of your own instincts. They make you feel like the crazy one for noticing what is right in front of your face. But 3 things happened over the next month that I could not pray away, no matter how hard I tried. The first thing happened on a Sunday morning, the same Sunday I mentioned at the very beginning of this story. Bishop Whitfield was giving the sermon, and somewhere in the middle of it, completely unscripted, he started talking about forgiveness within marriage, about how some couples go through seasons of testing that outsiders should never interfere with, about how gossip and suspicion within the church family can destroy what God is trying to heal. He did not say my name. He did not say Daniel's name. But he looked directly at me, twice, while he said it. And I felt every single eye in that congregation that knew anything subtly shift toward our pew. I sat there, holding Daniel's hand because I did not know what else to do with mine, feeling like I was being publicly shamed in code, in front of 200 people, for daring to question my own husband. The second thing happened 2 weeks later, when I ran into Carol, the church secretary, at the grocery store completely by accident. She looked at me with something in her eyes that I can only describe as guilt. We made small talk for a minute, and then, almost like the words escaped her before she could stop them, she said, "I hope everything worked out with whatever you and the bishop talked about that day. He seemed pretty shaken up after you left his office." I asked her what she meant by shaken up, and she immediately backpedaled, said she misspoke, said she needed to get going, and practically ran her cart away from me. A woman who had known me for years, who had never once acted strange around me, suddenly could not get away from me fast enough. That is not nothing. That is a person who knows something they are terrified to say out loud. The third thing, the thing that finally broke the dam completely, happened on a Tuesday night when Daniel thought I was asleep. I heard his phone buzz on the nightstand over and over, and when he stepped out of the room to take the call quietly in the hallway, I did something I had never done before in 11 years of marriage. I got up and I followed him, staying just close enough to listen without being seen. And what I heard was not Daniel's voice that scared me most. It was the voice on the other end, slightly audible through the speaker, a voice I recognized instantly because I had heard it every single Sunday of my adult life. It was Bishop Whitfield, and he was not confronting Daniel. He was warning him. I heard him say the words, "She's getting too close. You need to be more careful or this is going to come out the wrong way, for both of us." For both of us. I stood in that hallway, in the dark, in my own home, and I finally understood that this was never just about my husband's affair. This was about a man of God who had known the truth from the very moment I sat across from him in his office, possibly even before that, and instead of telling me, instead of protecting the family he had baptized and married and prayed over for 15 years, he had chosen to protect his own reputation and Daniel's standing in the church, at the cost of my sanity, my dignity, and my right to know the truth about my own life. I want to tell you that I burst into that hallway right then and confronted both of them. I want to tell you I had some powerful, scripted speech ready to go, but the truth is messier than that. The truth is, I went back to bed, silently, and I lay there until morning, staring at the ceiling, running through 11 years of memories, trying to figure out how far back this went, how much of my marriage, how much of my faith, how much of my entire community had been built on a lie that the most trusted man in my life had personally helped maintain. The next morning, I did not confront Daniel directly. I did something smarter. I started building a case, quietly, methodically, the way you do when you finally accept that the people around you are not going to give you the truth willingly, and you are going to have to take it. I started keeping a small notebook in my car, writing down dates and times whenever Daniel claimed to be at church for something. I started checking the actual church calendar, which Carol, despite everything, was inadvertently helping me with every time we spoke, because she could not lie to me as smoothly as the men around her could. I found out that out of the 14 late-night meetings Daniel had attended over the past 2 months, only 4 of them actually appeared on any official church schedule. 10 lies. 10 nights he told me he was serving God, when he was somewhere else entirely. I also did something that I think every woman in this position eventually has to consider, even if it terrifies her. I requested copies of our joint bank statements going back 8 months, something I had never bothered to scrutinize before because I trusted my husband completely with our finances. And there it was, in black and white, charges I had never questioned because they seemed so mundane. A jewelry store charge here, a hotel charge there, always conveniently timed with what Daniel called late elder meetings. A recurring charge to a flower delivery service that I had never once received flowers from. I sat at our kitchen table with 8 months of bank statements spread out in front of me, the same kitchen table where Bishop Whitfield had once held my hands and prayed for our marriage during a rough patch years earlier. And I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as a quiet, cold determination. I was done being the woman who prayed her way around evidence. I was done letting a man in a robe tell me what my own eyes and instincts were allowed to see. I confronted Daniel 3 days later, on a Friday night, after our children were asleep. I laid everything out on the table in front of him, the necklace receipt, the note, the bank statements, the 14 meetings that were really only 4, and I told him I knew about the conversation I overheard in the hallway, the one with Bishop Whitfield warning him to be more careful. I watched my husband's face go through every stage of a man who knows he has been caught. First denial, weak and immediate, the kind that comes out automatically before the brain even catches up. Then anger, accusing me of going through his things, of not trusting him, of being paranoid. And then, when none of that worked, when I simply sat there silently and let him exhaust every excuse, he finally broke, and he told me the truth. Or at least a version of it. Her name was someone he had met through a couples counseling session he and the bishop had been running together for struggling marriages in the church. She had come to them 6 months earlier, going through a difficult divorce, and Daniel had been assigned, along with the bishop, to provide spiritual guidance and support. Somewhere in those private counseling sessions, something had shifted from spiritual support into something else entirely. He told me it had been going on for nearly 5 months. He told me the bishop had known almost from the beginning because the affair had actually started inside the church building itself, during what were supposed to be confidential counseling sessions, sessions the bishop himself had personally scheduled and overseen the calendar for. I asked him the question that mattered most to me in that moment. I asked him if Bishop Whitfield had ever once tried to stop it, ever once told him this was wrong, ever once warned him to end it before it destroyed his marriage and his family. And Daniel looked at me and he said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "The bishop told me as long as I kept it quiet and kept showing up for my responsibilities at church, it was between me and God, not between me and the congregation. Between me and God. Not between me and my wife, not between me and my children." The bishop had drawn an invisible line that conveniently protected the church's reputation, while leaving my entire family standing outside of it, completely unprotected, completely in the dark. I want to take a moment here because I know some of you listening have lived through something similar. Maybe not with a church, maybe with a family business, a close friend group, a tight community where everyone protects the image of the group over the well-being of the individual inside it. And I want you to know, if you have ever felt crazy for noticing the cracks before everyone else was willing to admit they existed, you were not crazy. You were paying attention. The people around you were simply choosing comfort over honesty, and it is never, ever your fault for refusing to keep choosing that same comfort once you know the truth. The days after that confrontation are honestly a blur to me even now. I remember packing a bag for myself and the children and staying at my sister's house for a week, needing distance, needing silence that was not filled with lies. I remember Daniel calling repeatedly, then Bishop Whitfield himself calling, not Daniel but the bishop, trying to mediate, trying to convince me that reconciliation was the godly path forward, that the church family needed to heal together, that airing this publicly would hurt more people than it would help. I remember sitting in my sister's guest bedroom, staring at my phone with the bishop's name on the screen, and finally, for the first time in 15 years, I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I did not call him back that day, or the next day. I think that silence terrified him more than any accusation could have, because a man like Bishop Whitfield was used to controlling the narrative, used to people coming to him for answers, used to being the final word on what was right and wrong inside our community. My silence took that control away from him for the first time, and I think some small, petty part of me needed to feel that power, even just once, after months of feeling like I had none. Word started spreading through the congregation slowly, the way these things always do, not through any announcement, but through whispers, through people noticing Daniel and I sitting in different pews, through people noticing I had stopped attending Wednesday Bible study, through Carol the secretary, who I later learned had quietly confirmed certain details to a few trusted friends when directly asked, perhaps her own quiet form of guilt finally finding an outlet. Within 3 weeks, what had been a private nightmare inside my own home became a congregation-wide reckoning. Other women started coming forward, not about Daniel specifically, but about Bishop Whitfield's pattern of handling, or rather mishandling, sensitive situations within the church for years. One woman shared that the bishop had counseled her to stay quiet about her own husband's drinking problem for the sake of his deacon position. Another shared that he had discouraged her from reporting financial misconduct by a church board member because it would, in his words, bring shame upon the body of Christ. A pattern began to emerge that I had never seen clearly until my own pain forced me to look directly at it. Bishop Whitfield's primary concern, again and again, year after year, had never truly been the well-being of the families in his congregation. It had been the preservation of the institution itself and the men who held power within it. I eventually learned something that genuinely shook me to my core, something I am still trying to process even as I tell you this story. The woman Daniel had the affair with was not the only one. There had been at least one other situation, 2 years prior, involving a different married man in the church, a situation Bishop Whitfield had also personally helped contain and quiet, ensuring it never reached the wife, never reached the congregation, all in the name of protecting what he called the spiritual health of the community. I confronted him one final time, about 6 weeks after everything came out, not in his office this time, but in the church parking lot, after most people had already left following a Sunday service I had forced myself to attend, mostly for my children's sake, since they did not yet fully understand why our family felt like it was falling apart. I asked him directly, in broad daylight, with no desk between us, no leather chair to hide behind, why he had chosen, repeatedly across years, to protect men who were destroying their families instead of protecting the women and children those men had sworn to love and provide for. And Bishop Whitfield, for the first time since I had known him, did not have a smooth, practiced answer ready. He looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him look, standing there in the parking lot with his car keys in his hand. He finally said, quietly, almost to himself more than to me, "I thought I was protecting the church. I think I forgot somewhere along the way that the church was supposed to be the people, not the institution." I do not know if that was a genuine moment of reflection, or simply the only thing he could say once he no longer had any other excuse left to hide behind. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. I have wondered if he ever truly understood the damage he caused, not just to me, but to every other family he quietly protected men at the expense of. I have wondered if somewhere, right now, there is another wife sitting in his office, holding her own version of a necklace receipt, being told by him that she is misreading the situation, that she should pray on it, that she should not let suspicion destroy a good marriage. I left the church shortly after that conversation. Not in anger exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but mostly because I no longer knew how to sit in a building every Sunday where the man at the altar had personally chosen to let me live inside a lie for months, where the walls themselves held the secret of where my own husband's affair had quietly begun. Daniel and I are not divorced, not yet, though I genuinely do not know what the future holds for us. We are separated. He sees the children on weekends. We are both in individual counseling, with a counselor who has absolutely nothing to do with our former church, someone neutral, someone whose only concern is the truth and our well-being, not the reputation of any institution. Some days I think there might be a version of healing somewhere down the road for our marriage. Other days I look at him and I see a man who only told me the truth because the evidence left him no other choice, and I wonder if I will ever fully trust another word that comes out of his mouth for the rest of my life. But the question that haunts me the most, more than Daniel's betrayal itself, is the one I asked at the very beginning of this story. If the bishop already knew, why did he let me keep believing the lie? Was it really about protecting the institution, like he claimed in that parking lot? Or was it something simpler, something darker, something about men protecting other men, about power protecting power, about an entire system quietly built to keep wives like me in the dark for as long as possible, because our pain was simply less important than the comfort of everyone else around us? I do not have a clean answer for you. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you that justice was served, that Bishop Whitfield was removed from his position immediately and faced real consequences, that Daniel and I either healed completely or separated cleanly with no lingering pain. But real life rarely hands you the neat ending you see in movies. Bishop Whitfield is still leading services at that church as of the day I am telling you this story, though attendance has noticeably dropped, and quiet conversations continue to spread among the families who once trusted him blindly the way I did. Daniel is still in therapy, still saying all the right words, still showing up for our children every weekend, and I still do not know if I believe any of it the way I used to. What I do know is this: I will never again hand my own instincts over to someone else to interpret for me, no matter how much spiritual authority, how much community trust, how much history that person holds in my life. I will never again sit across from someone and let them tell me that what I am seeing with my own eyes is simply a misunderstanding that prayer alone will fix. Some things require more than prayer. Some things require the courage to keep looking, even when the people who are supposed to protect you are quietly begging you to stop. If you are listening to this and some part of this story feels familiar to you, if you have ever felt like the people around you knew something before you did and chose silence instead of honesty, I want you to trust that feeling. I want you to keep that notebook in your car if you need to. I want you to ask Carol, the secretary, the second question, even when the first answer feels like enough. I want you to follow the sound of a voice in the hallway, even when part of you desperately wants to stay in bed and pretend you heard nothing. Because the truth, even the most devastating version of it, will always be safer to stand on than a lie someone else built for you to live inside. I still go to church sometimes now, a different one, smaller, quieter, where nobody knows my story yet, where I sit in the back pew instead of the third one from the front, and I listen carefully to every word the pastor says, watching his face the way I never thought to watch Bishop Whitfield's face for all those years. I am not looking for another reason to doubt. I am simply choosing, finally, after everything, to trust my own eyes first, and everyone else second. And maybe that is the only ending I can honestly give you today. Not a resolution, not a verdict, just a woman who finally stopped waiting for permission to believe what she already knew was true. There is one more piece of this story I have not told anyone outside of my sister and my counselor, and I think you deserve to hear it, because it changes the way I understand everything that happened, and it might be the most unsettling part of this entire journey. About 2 months after I left the church, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Handwritten, careful, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone older, someone who learned penmanship in a different era. I almost did not open it, thinking it was some kind of solicitation, but something about the weight of the envelope made me sit down at my kitchen table before tearing it open. It was from a woman named Margaret, 73 years old, who explained in the letter that she had been a member of that same congregation for over 30 years, long before Bishop Whitfield ever arrived to lead it. She said she had heard through the quiet network of church gossip what had happened to me, and she felt, in her words, that she could no longer carry her own silence without saying something to at least one person who would understand exactly what she meant. Margaret wrote that Bishop Whitfield was not the first spiritual leader in that church to handle a husband's betrayal this way. She said the church itself, as an institution, had a long, unspoken tradition, passed quietly from leadership to leadership, of protecting the reputations of men in positions of influence within the congregation, deacons, elders, men who tithed generously, men whose families brought stability and donations and respectability to the church as a whole. She wrote that 30 years earlier, she herself had gone to the bishop before Whitfield with concerns about her own husband, concerns eerily similar to mine, and had been given almost identical advice. Pray on it. Do not let suspicion destroy a good marriage. Protect the unity of the church family. She told me her marriage had ended anyway, 2 years later, in far more painful and public circumstances than mine, after her husband's behavior became impossible to hide even with the church's help. She said she watched, decades later, as the same pattern repeated itself with different names, different families, the same institutional instinct kicking in every single time, like a machine designed for one single purpose, protecting men in power and the image of the church above the truth and well-being of the women who trusted it. I sat at that kitchen table holding Margaret's letter for almost an hour, and I felt something shift in me that I cannot fully put into words even now. This was not simply about Bishop Whitfield being a flawed man who made one bad judgment call under pressure. This was a pattern, possibly stretching back generations, a structure built specifically to absorb betrayal quietly, to metabolize it before it could ever reach the surface and damage the institution's image. I was not an isolated incident. I was simply the most recent name in a long, mostly invisible list of women who had sat in that same office, in that same leather chair, and been told the exact same thing. I wrote Margaret back. We have spoken on the phone 3 times since then. She is the only person from anywhere near that church world who has ever told me the complete, unfiltered truth without flinching, without softening it, without trying to protect anyone's reputation but mine. There is something strange and almost sacred about finding solidarity with a stranger 30 years older than you, simply because you both survived the same quiet machine, decades apart, run by different men wearing the same robe. I also want to tell you about something that happened with my daughter, because it changed the way I think about what kind of mother I want to be moving forward and what kind of example I want to set for her about trusting her own eyes. She is 9 years old enough to sense that something in our family had changed, even though we were careful about what we said in front of her and her younger brother. One night, while I was tucking her into bed, she asked me, very quietly, almost like she was afraid of the answer, why we did not go to our old church anymore, and why Daddy did not live with us right now. I had rehearsed 100 different, careful, age-appropriate answers in my head for weeks, anticipating this exact question. But in that moment, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking at her small face waiting so patiently for an honest answer, I gave her something simpler than anything I had rehearsed. I told her that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt the people who love them, and sometimes other grown-ups, even ones we trust very much, try to hide those choices instead of helping fix them, and that Mommy decided it was more important to tell the truth and be brave than to pretend everything was fine just to make other people comfortable. She thought about that for a long moment, the way children do when they are turning something over carefully in their minds. And then she said something that absolutely broke me open in the best possible way. She said, "So you found out the truth even when people didn't want you to know it?" I told her yes, exactly that. And she nodded, like that explanation made complete sense to her, like courage was simply that simple when you said it out loud to a 9-year-old, and she rolled over and went to sleep without another question. I lay awake a long time after that conversation, thinking about how much of my own life I had spent assuming that trusting authority, trusting titles, trusting robes and pulpits and 15 years of friendship was the same thing as trusting truth. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And I think the deepest wound Bishop Whitfield left in me, even deeper than watching him protect my husband, was realizing how long I had confused the two. I want to go back, for a moment, to that conversation I overheard in the hallway, because there is a detail I left out earlier that I think matters enormously, and I have replayed it in my mind more times than almost anything else in this entire story. After the bishop told Daniel, "She's getting too close. You need to be more careful," or "This is going to come out the wrong way, for both of us," there was a pause on the line, and then I heard Daniel ask him something I did not expect. He asked quietly, almost desperately, "What if she already knows and she's just waiting?" And Bishop Whitfield laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not loud, just a short, tired exhale of a laugh, the kind a man gives when he has underestimated someone for a very long time and has not yet realized his mistake. He said, "She doesn't know anything, trust me, I would know. I would know." Those 3 words have stayed with me longer than almost anything else either of them said that night, because they revealed something about how Bishop Whitfield saw me, saw all the women in his congregation, saw the wives who sat quietly in pews, trusting him with their entire spiritual lives. He believed, with complete confidence, that he could read me, predict me, manage me, the same way he had apparently managed Margaret 30 years earlier, the same way he had managed at least one other family 2 years before mine. He believed women like me were predictable enough to control with a few calm words and a folded set of hands across a wooden desk. He was wrong. And I think that is part of why this story matters so much to me, why I am telling it to you now instead of letting it stay buried inside my own private grief. Every single woman who has ever been told to pray harder instead of look closer. Every wife who has ever been handed someone else's comfort instead of her own truth. Every person who has ever trusted a title more than their own gut instinct deserves to know that the people protecting the liar are usually counting on you staying exactly where they left you. Quiet. Doubting yourself. Waiting for permission you were never going to receive. Do not wait for permission. That is, if I am honest, the entire lesson buried underneath every single detail of this story. I did not wait for Bishop Whitfield's permission to keep investigating after he told me I was misreading the situation. I did not wait for Daniel's permission to check the bank statements he assumed I would never look at. I did not wait for Carol's permission to ask her the second question after her first answer felt incomplete. Every single piece of truth I uncovered in this entire nightmare came from the moments I stopped waiting for someone else to hand it to me and decided instead to go looking for it myself. I think about the version of me sitting in that leather chair in the bishop's office, hands shaking, desperate for him to simply tell me the truth so I would not have to dig for it myself. I feel compassion for her now looking back, because she did not yet know what I know now. She did not yet know that sometimes the people we trust most with our pain are the very people most invested in making sure that pain never fully surfaces. I wish I could go back and tell her not to leave that office so easily. I wish I could tell her to push harder, to ask the question twice, 3 times, to notice the half-second of exhaustion that crossed his face before he composed himself into practiced compassion. But I cannot go back. None of us ever can. All we can do is take what we know now and refuse to ever hand our instincts over so easily again. So where does that leave me today? Months removed from a necklace receipt in a garage, months removed from a hallway conversation in the dark, months removed from a parking lot confession that gave me half an answer and 1,000 more questions. It leaves me here, telling you this story, hoping that somewhere out there, another woman sitting in a similar leather chair, in a similar office, across from a similar trusted authority figure, hears something in this story that makes her push just a little harder before she accepts the comfortable answer she is being offered. I still do not know exactly what comes next for Daniel and me. I still do not know if Bishop Whitfield will ever face any consequence beyond a slowly shrinking congregation and a handful of uncomfortable, whispered conversations after Sunday service. I still do not know if Margaret's letter is the last piece of this puzzle, or if there are other women out there, other decades, other names I will never learn, who lived through some version of this same quiet machine and never found anyone to tell. What I do know, the one thing I am completely certain of as I sit here telling you all of this, is that I will never again mistake silence for peace, and I will never again mistake someone else's comfort for my own safety. If something in your own life feels like it is asking you to stay quiet, to pray harder instead of look closer, to trust a title instead of your own two eyes, I hope this story is the thing that gives you permission to stop waiting and start looking for yourself. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of your own version of a hallway you once stood in the dark, finally hearing the truth for the first time, I want you to sit with that for a moment before you go. Some stories do not end with closure. Some stories simply end with the truth finally being allowed to exist out loud, even if nobody ever apologizes for how long they kept it hidden from you.